Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I am delighted and honored to have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Ralph Kilman. Ralph is the CEO of Kilman Diagnostics and an internationally recognized authority on systems change, with an expertise on conflict management, change management, expanding consciousness, and quantum transformation, which we're going to speak more about today. He has created all of his company's online courses and assessment tools that train individuals and teams on these very important topics. These online products are used by such high-profile organizations as Amazon, Bank of America, DuPont, ExxonMobil, FedEx, GE, Google, Harvard University, JP Morgan, Chase, Microsoft, NASA. The list goes on, including the US Army and the World Health Organization. Ralph earned both his BS in Graphic Arts Management and MS in Industrial Administration from Carnegie Mellon University, and a PhD degree in the Behavioral Sciences in Management and Social Systems Design from the University of California, Los Angeles. He has consulted for numerous corporations throughout the United States and Europe, including AT&T, IBM, Ford, GE, Lockheed, Philips, and Xerox, and many others. And he's consulted for numerous healthcare, financial, government organizations, including the US Bureau of Census and the Office of the US President. Ralph has published more than 20 books and 100 articles. He has recently completed his legacy book, which integrates everything that he has created during these past 5 decades of his professional life, creating a quantum organization, the whys and hows of implementing 8 tracks to long-term success. And I highly recommend this book. Ralph is also the co-author of more than 10 assessment tools, including the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, the TKI, which I imagine some of you are very familiar with. Thank you so much, Ralph, for being here with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Virid.
So how about we get started with the legacy book? I'm curious, why did you choose to refer to that as the legacy book?
Well, it's interesting. It occurred during the pandemic where we are sitting around wondering, how do I spend my time given lockdown and restrictions on travel and so forth? And I can't tell you exactly how it happened, but I said, why don't I integrate everything I have ever done in one book and be done with it? And I said, okay, I'll give it a try. Let me begin. And I began, and this was last January 2021. And I worked every day for the next 6-7 months. And I created this 600-page book. And I'm just very happy with you. In fact, the best way to put it is, in looking at that book, I feel a total sense of completion. I never felt that before. I feel like I did what I came on this earth to do. So I can't even describe it, the feeling. It's like, I'm done. I don't have to do another book. It's all there. There's nothing else to say.
I imagine that many of the people listening are like, wow, that feeling of, having kind of completed your mission, your purpose, your calling. Of course, you are still growing and still giving, and I'm sure that there will be many more gifts for all of us to come. And it must be a really fulfilling, content kind of feeling.
Very much so. And it's a long book. There is one chapter, chapter 11, that goes for almost 100 pages, and it's all about expanding consciousness. So if you ask me what is my favorite chapter or part of the book, it's on expanding consciousness, because I believe that is the future of the work we have to do in organizations to help people realize their potential, personally and professionally.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And that is my personal mission as well. Would you be willing to share with our audience, what do you mean by expanding consciousness? Or even, let's just start with consciousness. What do you mean by that?
Well, there are so many models to explain it. One that I find easiest moves from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to spirit-centric. So what does that all mean? If I'm egocentric, if that's my state of consciousness, then I'm the only one who's really a human, and everyone else is an object and can be treated accordingly. So it's all about me, and everyone else I can just dismiss. If I move up to ethnocentric, I now include a reference group, a peer group, my family, my neighbors. And we're all human, but anything or anyone outside that group is a thing, is an object, and can be treated accordingly. So this is us versus them. I'll take care of my family, my neighborhood, my kids, my friends. Everyone else I'm unconcerned about. And then there's world-centric, which is I'm now concerned about the entire planet and every society on it. And then ultimately spirit-centric, where we start focusing on the entire universe, because we're probably not alone. And the best way to describe the highest stages of consciousness, I'm not there, but it's an aspiration, is that's when someone, so here, let's say we're in the US, and someone in Asia or Africa is hurting. That hurts us as much as if it happened to our own child. Because we are in it together. We are one humanity. We are connected. So if you really feel that world-centric, spirit-centric consciousness, you feel everything. You don't say, I'm going to just take care of my kids. They're more important than those strangers around the world. We're all human beings, and we have to work on this problem of evolution and development together.
And thank you. And so what is meant by expanding consciousness? I mean, I can presume it's going up the levels, if you will.
Yeah, there's a lot of stage models, say where you begin. Egocentric is one such model, comes from the work of Ken Wilber and many others who position consciousness that way. And we begin with egocentric, and then the question is, can I go beyond that? Can I start incorporating other people like friends, family, neighbors? Can I start incorporating people who are different from me, ethnic, religious, political, geographical? And can I recognize that we're all in this humanity struggle together? That's expanding consciousness. And when I embrace all that, another thing that happens is at the lowest levels of consciousness, the emotions that are often experienced are anger, fear, pride, ego, taking care of oneself. But it's a very limited view. Whereas we eventually get to the point of love, peace, joy, compassion. Now, how different does that sound? Anger, grief, pride versus love, peace, joy, and compassion. And if we can approach all our interactions, all our conflicts, all our problems from those higher emotional energies, everything goes differently. The conversation is different. People don't get on the defensive. They are more willing to work together. Love is the answer. So all the songs that talk about love, they're absolutely correct.
Thank you. And you know, it's so cool to be having this conversation with a person who truly has an expertise on organizational change and what it takes. And you know, that word love, you know, is not often spoken in organizations. Certainly, we have more and more enlightened senior executives and owners that are radiating that, if you will, you know, to their teams and ultimately down to everybody in the organization. And so how do we even start that conversation with someone who is not there yet?
Well, one way to put this in perspective is I remember on many occasions I was making this presentation to large audiences of several hundred people, and I asked them to raise their hand if in their personal lives they have experienced such things as Reiki and therapy and yoga and mindfulness, meditation. I go down a whole list of different modalities that people have used to improve and understand themselves and their life. And most people raise their hand. They've done some of these things. They are doing some of these things. And then I'm asking them, now, how many people here talk about these topics in the workplace? All the hands come down. It's taboo. Because if you've ever been to therapy, there's something wrong with you. If you're trying to relax with mindfulness, why are you under so much stress? Why can't you handle this? There is this negativity about exploring oneself and being proud of that fact that I'm trying to learn and become a better person. Isn't that something we should take pride in? If you can take pride in anything, become a better person, the best version of yourself, as some people have said. So I think we have to begin by letting people know that why is this cultural norm that we can't bring our full selves into the organization? What's going on with that? That's a place to start. I mean, many, many years ago in the Industrial Revolution, there'd be signs in England that would say, hands for hire. The companies only wanted your hands, nothing else. Then eventually they recognize that people are social creatures. We have to motivate them. We have to inspire them. Then they have to learn computer skills and critical thinking skills. So gradually we've had to develop more skills to bring into the workplace. But the last remaining one to address is consciousness itself. Who I am, what I want, why am I here? Why was I born? What's my piece of the puzzle? And just like I said about my legacy book, what will bring me completion that I have achieved what I was born to do? Why was I given this privilege of life to begin with? And to really get people to ask those questions. Sometimes in audiences, I've said, are you happy? And people say, well, what are you talking about? I said, it's an important question. Are you happy? And then the conversation begins, because often they find I might be happy in my home life, but I don't like going to my organization. I don't enjoy it. I do it because I have to pay the bills, but it's toxic here. I don't like it. This is not fun. As opposed to creating a system in the organization where people can't wait to get to work because they thrive. And most adults spend most of their time in some work situation, 50 hours a week, whatever. That's where we spend our time mostly. So the question is, what is life like in those 50 hours a week? And if they're not fulfilling, I can't make it up in my basement with a hobby, because I'm spending most of my time being in an unhappy state. So we start realizing that by bringing consciousness into an organization, we can be happier, we can enjoy ourselves, we can look forward to coming to work, we can see the pleasure in helping other people and providing products and services that make a difference in the world. And people start realizing it can be different, but they need to be exposed to that. They're often in a rut, a culture rut. They do the same thing day in and out. In fact, it's been said that most people live out their conditioned lives. You're born into a family, a neighborhood, a religion, an ethnic group, a country, a religion, a political perspective, and you stick with it the rest of your life and you don't question a thing. You just live it out. And then maybe at most one person in the family, quote unquote, gets out. By gets out, I mean they look at themselves and say, do I just want to carry forward what was given to me? What do I like about what I experienced? What do I not like? What do I want to do different? What needs to change? But that's still a fairly rare question. Again, I would say this, from my experience, the great majority of people, over 99%, are living out their conditioned life from their family and friends. They're still acting out the traumas that never got resolved from their childhood. So it's a wonder they can have any quality conversation on a complex problem today. This is what we're facing. And finally, we just have to stop talking about it and do something about it. It's the systems, the culture of organizations that prevent people from growing. We have to change that.
So how do we do it?
Well, it takes senior leadership and commitment. In every organization I've consulted, if the senior members are not behind the lead, the charge, the effort to improve things, it's not going to happen. You can do it pockets in organizations, but ultimately bringing consciousness into an organization and changing the culture is the responsibility of senior leadership and management. So if they're waiting around for things to change, it's not going to change. In fact, one of the assessments I developed is called the Organizational Belief Survey. And what that measures is the extent to which you believe that what happens to you is determined by what you do or by external forces. And I go into organizations and I give them this belief survey. And what's amazing is in many organizations, they come out high on external control. What that means is they believe what happens to them is determined by outside forces, their boss, other people, the reward system, the culture, and that they can't do anything about it. And so picture this, people are sitting there with their arms folded, waiting around for things to change. And what happens if you go to the top level of the organization? The senior executives are waiting for the economy to change. Everyone's waiting for someone else to change. Whereas internal control is saying, I'm responsible for my own behavior. If things are going to change around here, I have to do it. I'm responsible for these surrounding systems. If I don't like the culture, if I'm confused about the strategy, if I don't like the organization of my work group, If I don't find that the reward system inspires me, let's talk about it. Let's change it. It's up to us. And that's when there's a shift. So again, I would say senior executives have to look at internal versus external control. And what happens when, in fact, most of the organization believes in external control and they're just waiting for someone else to change them? Another aspect to give you, I often have people take in organizations this Thomas Kilmann instrument, which measures how you respond to conflict. And then what I do is I have people take the instrument with modified instructions. Instead of saying, how do you usually respond when your wishes differ from another person? I say, in this organization, how do you usually respond when you find yourself in conflict? And then we take each box on the organization chart and we show the results of the TKI model. And what we find at the senior levels of the organization, often the executives are high on competing and compromising, collaborating, what we call the more assertive modes. But as we move down the organization, there's more avoiding and accommodating. And yet, when we ask those people to take another TKI with the instructions of how do you respond to conflict outside this organization, we get different results. People at all levels are more assertive. So then executives look at these results and say, so we're paying these people all this money, but yet they're avoiding, they're accommodating, they're just giving us lip service. They're not telling us what they really believe. They're not sharing their expertise and information. We got to do something about that. So that's a telling result. So sometimes you have to present some data, some evidence that tells you you're not getting the value of your human capital because they're avoiding and accommodating everything that's going on here. And they don't believe anything can change anyway. Well, that is very telling. And then senior executives have to come to terms with, do we want it comfortable or do we want long-term organizational success? Are we willing to bite the bullet and make the difference and move things forward, even if there's uncertainty and even if there's confusion, even if there's some chaos? This is our responsibility. So that's the direction.
Thank you. And I think that there is such power in your tools, because it's one thing to present evidence of other companies or kind of concepts that sound really good. It's a completely different thing to actually see how your people are responding to those questions. And so let's say they take the assessment and they realize that there is this gap, if you will. What's next?
Well, then the question is, how do we close the gap? And that's where the 8 tracks comes in. And the 8 tracks I developed over 50 years. It took me that long. Yes, that was my mission. And the 8 tracks are a sequence of change initiatives, but they're in a particular order. That's what's clue. So often organizations, they throw change programs at people. This year, it's the year of teams. Next year, it's the year of the employee. Next year after that, we're going to focus again on strategy. After that, we're going to focus on culture. It's all haphazard. It's all chaotic. Nothing builds. Nothing changes. In fact, sometimes they have a pool in the organization which says, who can guess the name of next year's program of the year? And if we wait it out, just like all other programs, it will go away. Now, instead, the 8 tracks are a sequence. The first track is culture. Yes, without culture change, no other conversation will take place. And what we do with culture, and I have an assessment for that called the culture gap, where we make a distinction between actual norms and desired norms. And sometimes the actual norms are, don't take a chance of disagreeing with the boss. Keep your good ideas to yourself. Don't share information with other groups. They really don't want your ideas. Just keep quiet and stay out of trouble. Don't rock the boat. Don't make waves. Be quiet. Whereas the desired norms are, we've got important conflicts and problems to solve. We have to work together. We have to share what we know because we need that information to make better decisions. We have to work together. One individual on his or her own cannot address these problems. We need everyone's expertise aligned and together. And then there's a gap. Well, how do we close that gap? Well, first, by talking about it helps. Usually there's a lot of laughter when people realize that they've been doing this to one another without ever talking about it. And then they say, okay, these are the desired norms. We have to close the gap. And they develop then what's called a sanctioning system. which is an informal reward system before we address this later in the tracks with the reward system itself. And what the sanctioning system is, what is legal and ethical that we can do when anyone violates and acts out the actual norm instead of desired norm. So let's say that the desired norm is come to meetings on time so we can get our work done, whereas the actual norm was if you're important, you'll come late. Let people wait on you. That tells people how important you are, as if that has anything to do with solving a complex problem. And then when someone shows up late, here's the way the sanctions work. First, people look at their watches, they look at the person, they say, remember, we were going to be on time. And the person is, oh, yeah, okay, this won't happen again. Well, when it happens again, there are stronger sanctions. Ultimately, the sanctions lead up to public humiliation. It's the sanctions that keep human behavior in line. If you ever want to hear about sanctioning systems, talk to people from the military. They'll give you 1,000 stories about what they do to one another who violates the norms. Well, when we bring this into organizations, again, we can have fun with this. It has to be legal. It has to be ethical. But we have to make the message clear. Those actual norms can no longer work. They can no longer be tolerated. We have to act according to the desired norms, and we're going to help one another do that. And as they use this sanctioning system, then they find out no wonder change is so difficult. If we don't get feedback and remind one another of what needs to be done, it's so easy to slip back into the old habits. That's human nature. So how do we break that? In fact, I also use this thing called the 3-day washout effect. And that's, I remind people, 3 days after an off-site training program where they've learned wonderful things, 3 days after that, it's as if the workshop never took place because it's back to business as usual. So someone comes back from a workshop telling his boss, oh, I learned something really cool about critical thinking skills. And the boss says, that's wonderful. Now get back to work. So it doesn't transfer. Millions and billions of dollars are spent in training programs where the lessons stay in the workshop and never find their way into the workplace. These are things we have to point out and overcome. I also have what is called a process observer, where at the start of every meeting, one person gets assigned this PO, process observer, and they have to observe the group according to a number of guidelines. And at the end of the meeting, they give feedback on how things went and what needs to be done better next time. Without that kind of mechanism, they don't talk about group process. They don't try to improve. They don't listen to one another. And some of the principles are, did people get asked to give their input? Were quieter people drawn into the group? Were people being highly critical of one another? Were they not being respectful? How did they manage the conflicts? Did they talk about it openly, or did they avoid everything that was important? And then they say, what are we going to be do differently next meeting? The first few times there's a process observer, they say something like, the first minute you guys were great, and then it deteriorated into our usual nonsense and all our chaos and non-listening behavior. Next time, maybe they'll hold out for 5 minutes before they fall back into their habits. But eventually, by becoming conscious of how the group functions with feedback, with discussion, things begin changing.
Thank you. I'm so excited to hear you share this because I agree with you. First of all, I'm familiar with the stages at this point, and I'm excited for you to share even more of those, of course, tracks. And I want to just kind of share a couple of points about what you've shared. So the idea of sanctions is so important because we need that, right? If there were no cops in the world, right, some of us might speed more than we, when we might otherwise.
If there's no consequence for doing something that negatively affects people, why would people do anything differently? There has to be consequences. We don't have to be brutal. We don't have to hurt people, and we can have fun while doing it. But we have to point out when we're not doing things that lead to long-term success, period.
That's right. Because we don't have choice without awareness. And I love also the idea, of course, of rewarding. That's why I love that you said to make it fun, right? So yes, there is the kind of consequences if we don't, but there's also the rewards if we do, right? The celebrations, which is such a wonderful...
you absolutely point out, once we're moving in the right direction, we will celebrate, and we will do it this way. We're very explicit, very explicit.
Yeah. And the 3-day washout, effect, I think is so brilliant. And many of us have been there. And that's why the really good trainings are the ones that work with people at a deeper level, give them some experience where we're not just working with the conscious mind, but we're also creating some shift at the inner level, right? At the unconscious level, thinking differently, feeling differently, perceiving differently.
Yeah. In fact, let me mention another assessment I use that also brings out some powerful lessons. It's called the Organizational Courage Assessment. And what it measures is two dimensions. Do people observe acts of courage? And how afraid would people be if they performed those acts of courage? And we find out that there are four kinds of organizations. One is the fearful organization, where you don't see those acts of courage because people are so afraid of the negative consequences. Okay. And then the courageous organization is basically when people do the right thing to lead things forward, even though they're afraid of getting negative consequences. They're being courageous. And I used to think, wow, that's the best case, where you have people doing what needs to be done, even though they're afraid of receiving negative consequences. That makes them courageous. And then I asked myself the question, but why do people have to live in fear? And that's where the quantum organization comes in. Can't we do the right things and be supported? Why do we have to live in fear? One of the great quality gurus, W. Edwards Deming, had these principles. I think he had 14 or 16 principles. And the most important one, I think he cited it twice, drive out fear. He saw fear, and that's partly embedded in the culture, as being one of the things that prevents people from being who they are in the workplace. And that's why outside the organization, they respond differently to conflict, because they don't have the same fear situation. You take out fear, and then people can become themselves. So that's an important part. So courage, so organizations can find out if they're fearful, if they're bureaucratic, if they're courageous, or if they're quantum. And then again, the gap, where you are, where you want to be, what change initiatives do we organize in sequence to bring about a change? And again, after the culture track, there's 7 other tracks. There's skills track, team tracks. That's the informal organization. We have to get people talking, sharing, collaborating on important issues. Then we look at the formal systems, strategy, structure, and then the reward system. Where are we headed? How we organize to get there? And what do we get for helping out? But if you haven't gone through the first 3 tracks, what conversation will take place with strategy, structure, and rewards? Instead, what it is, it's called the Seagull Model of consulting, or senior executives. We dump a new strategy on the organization and expect everyone to follow it, even though they don't understand it. That's not how strategy and structure get implemented. So again, that behavioral infrastructure, culture, skills, teamwork, the first 3 tracks, they set the foundation for having quality discussions throughout the rest of the program. The problem is organizations want to jump in and do strategy, structure, reward system, or process changes. They don't have the infrastructure to even have the conversation. And therefore, it's not a surprise. 6 months, a year later, it's as if nothing had taken place. Nothing has changed. And we wait for the next program of the year.
Wow. Again, I imagine many of the leaders listening are thinking, wow, that's exactly what's happening. And I want to get out of that pattern. And I agree with you that those first 3 tracks are so key, because those fears that many of us operate out of, and of course that's, as you said, kind of starts from the sponsors of the change. Yes, those at the very top of the organization, so to speak. And, when those fears, oftentimes from very early childhood, or those kind of limiting beliefs, they're driving a lot of our behaviors. And so unless we're willing to go and be curious and compassionate with those parts of us to really understand what are the things we need to learn in order to expand our consciousness, it's just going to be a repetition of the same old patterns. So where do you think is most valuable for our conversation to go to now? Do you think it's more valuable for the leaders listening to spend a little bit more time on the first 3 tracks, or is there something else that you think would be even more relevant and important for them?
Well, even before we begin implementing any work in the first 3 tracks, we have to get buy-in. There has to be senior management support, and there has to be a diagnosis. and senior executives have to agree they're going to act on the diagnosis. So oftentimes they've been survey results and interviews, nothing happens. If nothing happens, after a while, people don't respond to surveys anymore. They don't show up for the interviews. But we have to find out what's going on in this organization and know it intimately well. And that's why sometimes when they've set up interviews, people don't show up and they say, we've told other consultants, nothing's going to change here. I don't want to waste my time. Then they've already lost the soul of the organization when people won't even talk about what causes them difficulty. But if we can get those interviews, that the organization is not lost, people are still willing to complain and talk about their frustrations and what they experience, then the outside consultants, and you generally need outside consultants for the diagnosis, so you're not too close to the culture. Otherwise, you don't see it. You need an outside objective observation. And then you do interviews randomly throughout the organization, and then you put together a diagnostic report. And that report then defines how precisely we implement the 8 tracks to close the gaps that were identified during the diagnosis. And throughout the program, I remind people of diagnosis. People say, we've been doing this for 6 months. Why are we doing this? And I say, let's review the diagnostic report, what you said was going on here, and what prevents you from doing well and realizing your purpose in life. Let's review that. That's the reason we're doing this. And then they say, oh yeah, okay, let's do it. Let's do it.
Brilliant.
So we go through that process. Incidentally, there's, just to give you another example, I did an instrument just a couple of years ago called the Kilman Organizational Conflict Instrument. Now, the TKI, Thomas Kilman, measures interpersonal conflict. The COSI, which I call the Kilman Organizational Conflict Instrument, measures the conflicts you have with your surrounding systems. So it asks questions about, are you in conflict with the culture, with the teams you're working with strategy, with structure? It's not about the people, it's about the systems. I would say that 80% of the behavior you see in organization is driven by the systems, not the personal inclinations of the members. So those systems are powerful. So sometimes we walk into an organization, we see the people, we don't see the systems. So we think everything is the people. But those people are working according to a job. They're assigned to a group. They have a goal through strategy. There's a culture. They have a boss. This all shapes their behavior. These outside systems determine at least 80%. So on this COSI instrument, we ask people, to what extent are you in conflict with the systems that surround you? That's a very telling sign as well. So again, in a nutshell, we use diagnostic interviews, all kinds of assessment tools to understand on key aspects, how is this organization functioning and what's preventing it from realizing its full potential for the future. It's that simple, and yet it's that complex.
And I know in your book, kind of early on in the book, you talk about kind of the 80-20, right? As you talk about kind of the systems, if you will. Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, just to put it in interesting terms, W. Edwards Deming put it at 85-15. He had a higher number than I did. So I'm being more conservative with 80. Well, it's a question of letting people know what influences their behavior, because often people don't think about it. You know, people think they make choices and that's all there to it. They don't realize how they have been conditioned. We have been so conditioned from day one. In fact, a beautiful book I read is called The 4 Agreements. And it's by, what's his name again? Ruiz, Miguel Ruiz. And in the beginning of the book, it points out in the most beautiful way I saw just how conditioned we are. In fact, he uses the term, we are domesticated. We are domesticated like dogs, pigs, and rabbits or whatever to behave a certain way. And as I mentioned earlier, most people don't break out of their conditioning. They live the life they were given. And anything different than what they are used to seems an aberration. It seems sick. It seems there's something wrong with me. I have to follow what I was given. But then every now and then someone says, wait a minute, I don't like some of this. Let me look at this. Let me change. But at most, one person in the family gets out. Usually no one. They just live out their lives. I think we have to change that. When with all the discussion now about violence in schools and about the wars that go on and the hatred we see in the streets, Those will not be addressed successfully until we raise the consciousness of all the people, especially the lawmakers who are making these decisions and who are affecting the results of our society. We have to raise the consciousness. Otherwise, we're going to repeat the same conversation for the next 50 years and nothing will change.
I'm on that mission with you. And my company does trainings on mindset, like how to shift limiting beliefs that often start very early on, right? Those fears, how to radiate more love into the field, right? That word that you said earlier,
Yeah.
to increase our own consciousness or personal consciousness, and of course that of the collective. And kind of going back to the concept of a quantum organization, how does one know if it has arrived? What is the kind of ultimate output of the work that you do with people?
Well, in my book, I have 7 principles that make a quantum organization. And they have a lot to do with encouraging and enabling the people to design their own systems, working together in a very participative way. So instead of things being dumped on them from the top, they get involved in actively working together across the boundaries to have discussions about strategy, structure, reward system, and any other complex problem, like should we have this merger decision? Should we go into this new product line? On and on. Should we acquire this firm? Those are complex problems that have long-term consequences. Who's going to make those decisions? Well, the brilliance is in the organization. Let's muster that energy and that compassion and that expertise to have the most lively and informed discussion on the most important issues that affect the future, instead of having a consultant or some senior executive put this down on the organization. A complex problem is defined where one person can't possibly have the information, knowledge, and expertise to solve it. Can't possibly. So therefore, you need other people with different areas of expertise. You need diversity. Hence, conflict arises. And if you want to manage that diversity, you have to manage the conflict. You had asked earlier, Vered, I just want to add one thing about any other relevant topic that can be discussed, and that has to do with mental health. You hear this creeping up every now and then, especially when there's gun violence in schools and people seem to have gone off the deep end or have meltdowns when they're asked to wear a mask or something like that. You say, what's going on there? I mean, what's being triggered? Well, not to oversimplify it, but I would say that every human being on this planet has been traumatized in childhood. It comes with the human condition. I can't imagine going through 18, 20 years of childhood and not being traumatized. I don't condone that. I don't wish it on anyone. But given that it happens, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with it? And here's the bottom line question. Can we transform a wound into a gift? Because all the great gifts in the world were born of early trauma. But the difference is, do you turn it into a gift by saying, because of what happened to me, I have more compassion, I have more love, I have more caring for others, I have empathy, I know what it's like, and I have to work with others to bring about a different environment. So that wound awakens people. Of course, in many cases, it keeps them down. They never go beyond their wounds. In fact, I sometimes paint a picture in organizations where everyone is acting out their wounds. How can they have any decent conversation if everyone reminds you of the person who perpetrated pain when you were 5, 10, 15, 20 years old? That's all being triggered. It's unconscious, but that's what's going on behind the scenes. But we have to understand what is mental health, not to stigmatize anyone, but to say we have challenges resolving early traumas. And if we can help one another address that, and yes, organizations have responsibility. If we want the best of our people, it's best if we remove trauma, resolve it, and turn it into a gift. Let's do that. But you ask most people today, what is mental health? They just think of people who need shock treatment or need to be committed to a hospital. They don't realize that like depression, anxiety, fear permeates so many lives. Those are mental health issues because they're born of trauma. But a person doesn't have to live with that. We can address it, both personally and through organization work.
Oh, thank you for bringing up that important topic. And I believe that's at the heart of the work that you do, because until there is inner harmony, I don't believe it's possible to have external harmony, whether it's in our families and our organizations or communities, because it's a mirror. Your outer world is a reflection of what's going on the inside. And when there is more harmony within all of those parts of us, then we can be more objective as we perceive the outside world and see it not through the lens of our beliefs.
Yeah, in fact, in my book, the Legacy book, and in my online course, Expanding Consciousness, I talk about the 4 inner conflicts that need to be resolved, because that predicts and determines how all outer conflicts are addressed. So again, as you said, it's if we don't resolve what's on the inside, all of that is going to be worked out, usually in a dysfunctional way, in a toxic way on the outside. And I don't know if you want to hear the 4 inner conflicts.
Very much so. Thank you.
I won't hide them from you. Okay. The first one is, and I purposely state these in extreme either or terms, but ultimately it's not a choice of either or. It's how do you do both at the same time? Okay. The first inner conflict is, am I an energy body or a physical body? Most people still seem to perceive themselves as physical and not energy. But if you walk into a room, you feel the energy as much as any words that are said. In fact, what I say to people is your energy carries more weight than your words. So if you can incorporate your energy and physical body together, you are in more control of how you express yourself and what impact you have on others. And that affects then how you address all your outer conflicts. The second one is, are you primarily governed, your behavior, by your ego or your soul? Again, it's not either or. Sometimes some of the Eastern writings talk about to aspire to your soul, you have to destroy your ego. No, you don't have to destroy anything. Why would you want to destroy anything? It's a question of understanding it and integrating it with everything else. How do we get the ego and soul on the same page? The ego is about desire, achievement, glory, immortality, fame, power, and all that kind of stuff. Fine, those are interesting energies. What about the soul? Very different. Why am I here? Why was I given this privilege of life? What am I here to do? What is my divine calling? Which is very different than, am I secure? Am I in control? Am I immortal? Am I all powerful? That's the ego speaking. So how do we get that energy from the ego into the soul so they're on the same page? So you can use your ego energy, so to speak. And I have a book on ego energy, by the way, that's part of the title. How to use that ego energy and direct it towards the reason for your being born on this planet in the first place. Okay, that's the second one. The third internal conflict is, am I, how shall I put it? It's like, is myself, some combination of, let's say, ego and soul, separate from my outside systems, or are my outside systems an integral part of who I am? If you see your surrounding systems as outside you, no one's taking responsibility for changing them. That's someone else's business. I'm just me, and I'm my skin encapsulated ego. That's it. Anything outside me is someone else's responsibility. As opposed to, and I'm suggesting this with the 8 tracks, realizing that we are our outside systems. We are responsible for those outside systems. We have to play a role in changing and improving those outside systems. That's not just some senior management or consultant's job. It's all our jobs. And if you can get people to see that their surrounding systems partially define who they are, you get their attention, and then we begin a discussion. And finally, the fourth internal conflict, and it's the fourth because it's the most difficult, and it's probably more likely to succeed after you've done some work on the first 3 inner conflicts. And the fourth one, are you ready?
Yes.
Have you resolved your primal relationships, or are you still acting out the pain from your childhood? And again, we position it as either or just to get the conversation going, when ultimately we realize, yes, I had those traumas, but I've resolved them. And now I can see that what I learned allows me to be kinder and more compassionate and have more empathy for all other people. regardless of any distinctions of whether it's age, gender, nationality, religion, political beliefs, you name it, I embrace all of it. That's what has
Wow.
to take place, as opposed to living out those traumas, acting it out on other people, and hurting other people in the process. So if we can resolve those 4 inner conflicts and have a lot of progress along those lines, you're going to unleash a wealth of human resources in your organization like has never been experienced before.
100%, absolutely. And we've seen it happen. And so it is possible. And in this podcast, we have many different episodes that help people through those 4 inner conflicts, if you will. For example, trainings on coherence, which is that state where your mind and your body are working together, your heart, your emotions, right? So it's not one or the other, it's an integration, or many different tools for releasing those primal attachments, those issues, right? Like EMDR or EFT tapping, Psyche, havening, many different modalities, because people can get that consciously, but the question is, how do they actually do it? And
Yeah.
I think that's where the gap is oftentimes. Either they believe they're too busy to go do therapy, or they just need simple tools.
Yeah. In fact, another book I wrote, published in 2013, is called The Courageous Mosaic, expanding. It's about awakening society, systems, and souls. That book summarizes a lot of the modalities for mind, body, spirit, consciousness, some of the ones you've already mentioned, okay, EMDR and others. And basically, it opens people's eyes to say there are methods available for individuals and organizations to raise consciousness. And I use myself as an example in that book. I didn't want to say, oh, this is good for you, but I don't have to do this. No, the book begins with my earliest trauma when I'm 3 years old, lying tied up in a hospital bed. And I had a number of those things happen to me in my childhood. I had surgery on my eye, I think 4 times. And yet I write about what it took to realize the trauma that was there and how to resolve it. So I could then see more in my own work on how things work together. I took sight to another level. But it's always a question, whatever your trauma was, no matter how horrible. And again, I don't condone it. I don't wish that on anyone, but it's going to happen. And once it happens, you ask yourself, what am I going to do with this? How do I turn this into something beautiful? As opposed to, do I want to spend the rest of my life in agony and pain and suffering for what happened to me 30, 40, 50 years ago? Everyone has that choice. Choose wisely.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it starts from choosing to be open and curious, and the path will come to you once you make that choice.
And if you're a senior executive, your responsibility might be to make sure that's available to everyone in the organization.
Absolutely. And it starts with them, right?
Because if I don't set the stage and set the model, people are going to look at my behavior as a senior executive on what's important and what to do. So I need to be very conscious of all the signals I send, because people are looking to see what's important. Let me tell them what's really, really important.
That's right. And it starts from them doing their own work, so that they can shift their consciousness, expand their consciousness, as you said, and to be able to more coherently express that message and that offer to the rest of the people.
And what's interesting is, as organizations make these changes, it seeps into the family life.
Oh.
And then people start applying the same material to their kids, their spouses, their friends, their neighbors. It's all relevant. It may begin with the organization, but people realize this affects every aspect of my life.
Well, that is how we ultimately transform our planet.
Absolutely.
And Ralph, through your books, your work, your just incredible curiosity and passion for this work and compassion for human souls, you are absolutely doing that. I believe you have fulfilled that legacy, and even more to come, and I'm eager to see what else you creatively come up with. And I'm just really grateful, really, really grateful for you sharing your wisdom, your experiences with us. I believe every single person, not just leader in any way, but really human being, needs to hear this conversation. And how can people learn more about your various assessments, your books, your amazing online programs?
Well, everything I ever created is not only in that book, Creating a Quantum Organization, it's also on my website. And on my website, kilmandiagnostics.com, one L, two N's, you will find all the online courses that embellish on everything I've said during this discussion, including all the assessment tools.
Thank you. And one last question before we complete. Imagine there's a little baby that's born. What is the most important thing that you want that little baby to know?
There is so much more to you than your body, which is now what you're primarily experiencing. And you will find that you have something called a soul, and that it has an expression, and that it wants to fill a certain purpose. And if your parents and society and neighbors and friends and relatives can support you and all your surrounding systems, you can live a life that has joy and meaning beyond comprehension.
Thank you.